Edith Wilson, the wife of the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Often referred to as the secret president, Edith played a major role in running the executive branch after her husband suffered a stroke. We visited the President Woodrow Wilson House in Washington, D.C., and the Edith Bolling Wilson Birthplace Museum in Wytheville, Virginia. This is Women of the White House. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hello. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson House.
We're so excited to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
Tell me about this neighborhood.
Sure. We're in Kalorama, which is a Kalorama neighborhood of Washington, D.C. We're not too far from DuPont Circle. This neighborhood, Kalorama, means beautiful view, Kalorama. And when the Wilsons moved here over 100 years ago, it was really a beautiful view looking down to the river. You could see everything. We're somewhat on a hill here. It is classic Embassy Row.
When did the Wilsons move into this home?
They moved into this house on Inauguration Day, March 4th, 1921.
And then how long did they stay here?
The Wilsons, well, Woodrow Wilson went on and he lived here for another 3 years, but his wife lived another 37 years. And so she preserved it pretty much like it was from the day he died. It's only really had 3 owners, the people who built it, the Wilsons, and then the National Trust. So it is really historic and preserved and beautiful, something you don't get to see.
I'm excited. Let's go see it.
Great. Here we are. So this is a Georgian revival style home. It is, as I said, it was built in 1915, and the style was meant to be cavernous in the center here, quite dark. The women's cloakroom was to the right, the men's cloakroom was to the left. This style of architecture is called an American basement, where these were public rooms, and then you would have walked through here, and you'll see when you come upstairs, the lights, it brightens up, and it's really quite pretty.
All right, let's check
So we'll go upstairs.
Before we take a look inside the home where she spent her final decades, it's important to learn how her life started.
Edith was born in Wytheville, Virginia on October the 15th, 1872. She was the 7th of 11 children who were born in this very building. Her father was Judge William Bolling and her mother was Sally. And before they moved to Wytheville, the Bollings had a plantation in Bedford County, Virginia, but after the Civil War, they lost almost everything.
The Bollings were very, very proud of their lineage. Most specifically, they traced it back directly to Pocahontas. This was something that the early colonial families in Virginia really liked to brag about. They called themselves the first families of Virginia. And so the lineage question is actually incredibly well documented within the Bolling family. And along the way, between Pocahontas and Edith, there are cousins related to Thomas Jefferson, other original Virginia founding fathers. If you're looking for blue blood, you definitely find it in Edith. When Edith was 18, she was done with school. She had gone to just a couple of years of formal school, which wasn't unusual. And she comes to Washington, and it's 1892. And 1892 Washington was booming. I mean, it was Gilded Age glamour. After the Civil War, Washington had been so beaten down that there was real talk about moving the capital west. And so the city fathers embarked on this huge public works project to make Washington gorgeous. So that's the world Edith moves to at 18. And she wasn't rich, but she was beautiful, and she really wanted to get out of Wytheville. So she took huge advantage of Washington.
And it was during her time in Washington that she met her first husband, a man who owned a successful jewelry store just steps from the White House.
Norman Galt, by all accounts, was a lovely man, perfectly nice, a few years older than Edith, absolutely gobsmacked by her. And she never acted like it was a love match. She knew it was, she described him as her friend, and a decent man and a thoughtful man, and she could do worse. So she marries Norman. It's a way for her to have some independence and to stay in Washington. They did have one baby who didn't survive, and that left her unable to have more children. And then unexpectedly, Norman died, leaving his business to Edith. So she was quite a young widow, but also quite well off and independent, and she could live life with an autonomy that most women of the era just didn't have access to.
We're going into the library.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow, it's beautiful.
Isn't it great? Come on in.
Did Woodrow spend a lot of time in here?
Yes, of all the rooms in this house, he spent the most time, we'd say, in this room. We have a number of items here that are from his collection. Actually, when they got married, it was, they moved into the White House, but then when they got this house, this is the first house that they ever had together.
Sure.
So it's a little bit of yours, mine, and ours.
Yeah.
And so the furniture is a little bit of hers, a little bit of his, and then the things they collected together. Almost everything you see in the house is authentic and original to the time that the Wilsons lived here together. So you'll see we have over 8,400 items in our collection. Mm-hmm. And we really, our job is to preserve this time capsule.
So there's a solarium in this beautiful house.
Yes, there is. Shall we go see?
Yeah, I'm excited. This is where I would spend all my time.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
And they did spend a lot of
They
time
spend
here.
a lot of their time here, definitely for breakfast every day, and sometimes for lunch as well. They'd have a table set up here. But it's spectacular, isn't it?
Look at this view. And so before, you would have been able to see to the river.
Yes, that's just Massachusetts Avenue. And so beyond that, you go slightly downhill and you'd see all the way down to Georgetown, to the river. You can see quite far. It's unusual to have all these plants in a museum. Most
Right.
museums, if you've ever noticed, you don't put live things.
Sure.
But part of my job is actually to keep these plants alive,
Why?
even in a museum, because some of them are propagated from Edith Wilson's collection. So that's from 1961 that we're trying to keep some of these alive.
That's amazing. That's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure. I know. It's the hardest thing about my job is keeping the flowers alive.
I would be fired. I can't keep anything alive.
Perhaps the most significant contribution from Edith to the White House was the suggestion that she ran the government after the president fell ill.
Looking back on Woodrow Wilson in Paris in 1918 and 1919, he was already not well. So by the time they got back from Paris in 1919, he was already exhausted and sick and emaciated and gray in the face. So the summer of 1919, he's negotiating with the Senate to include the League of Nations in the treaty. And it's a absolute tooth and nail, blood-drawn fight. And again, exhausting and no chance for recovery. But Wilson believed totally and completely that the League of Nations was his legacy. And he thought he was fighting for the future of the world. And so in the fall of 1919, they set off on this cross-country tour. And it was just as terrible as everyone predicted. And it caught up with him. So finally, he was on the train outside of Pueblo, Colorado, and collapses. And at this point, he can't recover. There's no way he can possibly continue the tour. They come screaming back to Washington. He's alert enough when he gets off the train at Union Station to kind of wave to the crowd and get in a car and go to the White House, and goes to bed. And a few days later, collapses again. And that waving to the crowds at Union Station turns out to be the last time he is seen in public for months. For months. So while Wilson was confined to his bed, Edith was his gatekeeper. It was to Edith that everything went. And people started to learn that it had to go to Edith. So cabinet secretaries start addressing letters to her. And she decided what he saw, what could wait, what was ignored completely. To be fair, she didn't really do anything that he wouldn't have done. She didn't start exercising her own priorities and go rogue. And because she had been involved with his intimate policy conversations for so long, she more or less knew what he would have done. But no one elected Edith. I mean, she had no business playing that role. Whether she, ultimately was a destructive force, I think is debatable. But she certainly owed it to the American public to be more clear about what was going on in the White House.
We'll go into the dining room.
You mentioned there wasn't a lot of entertaining, although they would have some dignitaries because he was sick and so forth. First ladies came?
Yes, absolutely. So Edith went on to live in this house for another 37 years. And one of the roles that she saw that was very important was to invite all the first ladies, each first lady, to come for lunch when they were now moved into the White House. The last first lady to come for luncheon here at the Woodrow Wilson House was Jackie Kennedy. And so, but we do have the plates that she had asparagus on. So.
Yeah. Well, it's such a beautiful tradition and something that, it's a very exclusive club.
It's a very, very exclusive club of first ladies. And she felt, she was the second wife. She was thrown into it in the middle of his presidency.
Right.
And she understood the gravitas, the importance of the role of First Lady. And so she felt it was important to invite the other First Ladies here.
A lot of people don't realize that there were two Woodrow Wilson presidency First Ladies.
Well, he was married to his first wife, Ellen, and for over 30 years, and she died in the White House. There was a little bit of matchmaking from his cousin and his personal doctor that they arranged a match to meet Edith Bolling Galt. She had been widowed, and they were a nice match. And so they met at the White House, and they started dating.
Very quickly.
Very quickly.
Ellen Wilson married Woodrow Wilson when they were much younger. She was the mother of their children, and she had come up with him in politics. She had been with him when he was a young professor. She was very quiet and shy. Woodrow Wilson was not a president who had a lot of close advisors. He didn't rely on a big cabinet full of experts. He really did keep his own counsel. But he really needed a couple of people really close to him, and Ellen was one of those. And so when she died, he was devastated.
When he met Edith, she was very different in that she was buxom and lively, and she was thinking on her feet.
She was such a forward-thinking woman. Whatever came her way, she may not have been prepared for that, but she was able to handle it. She learned all she could. She was very flexible, and she had an innate ability to adjust to the situations around her. She was just a smart woman.
So this is her portrait that was done, and we can compare this portrait to another portrait that's in the hallway. When this portrait was done, she did not like this. This was supposed to be
it's beautiful.
I know, right? What she said about this is that it made her look too young, too thin, and too stern. And who doesn't want to be too young or too thin?
I know. But maybe she just wanted to be herself.
She wanted to be seen as herself. And especially at this time, people had said, oh, well, maybe she was the first woman president, and she did not.
She was being accused of running the show because he had been ill.
Right, and she did not want to be seen as someone who was running the show. She wanted to be, she really defined herself as the steward and the steward of the president and the presidency. And so that's why you see her in this portrait. She said, no, that's not going to be my official portrait. She had this independent wealth, having inherited the Galt jewelry factory for jewelry company from her first husband, and she ran that. So she was a woman who, as I say, she did not know how to ride a bicycle, but she knew how to drive a car.
Edith also was the first woman in Washington to get a driver's license. She drove this little electric car that was basically a golf cart, and she tooled around town. She was so well known that the policeman at the corner of Pennsylvania Avenue and 15th Street would stop traffic and wave her through because he knew Mrs. Galt coming through in her little electric car. Given what we know about Edith Wilson's independence and smarts and desire to be known for her smarts and not just her looks, it might surprise people to realize she actually was not in favor of women having the vote. This was a time when suffrage was really steaming up.
At the presidential nominating convention of 1916, the suffragettes haunted the streets of Chicago. letting the delegates know in no uncertain terms their feelings on the inclusion of a pro-suffragette plank in the political platform.
The president didn't support the 19th Amendment, not initially. He thought that women voting should be left up to the states. And he finally came around to supporting the federal amendment, the 19th Amendment, when it was clear it was going to happen anyway. And he was worried that the Democratic Party would be blamed for being a roadblock to national suffrage, and there'd be all these new voters who would vote Republican. So he didn't come around to the federal amendment until it was politically useful for him to do so. So every so often, someone will float a theory that because he came around while he was married to Edith, that maybe she was whispering in his ear, that maybe she was the suffragist and she convinced him to change his mind on the amendment. It's just not true. She was against it, and she not only didn't approve of women voting, she didn't approve of the whole movement. They were picketing the White House throughout 1917 with some very critical banners of the president, calling him Kaiser Wilson, saying, "Take the beam out of your own eye." And she did not like that one bit. Not only were those women being sort of rude and not ladylike, but they were openly criticizing her husband, and that was never something Edith stood for. So as soon as women were enfranchised nationwide, she voted. She voted in the presidential election in 1920. She was the first lady to travel while first lady. And if you look at the pictures from the Paris treaty negotiations, she's right there next to him. She's standing there next to the Queen of England, and she's not a plus one. She is an example of leadership of America right there on the international stage. And now we think of first ladies as playing a diplomatic role all the time, right? They're dispatched to countries that the president can't get to because they play this sort of hearts and minds diplomacy role. No one had done that before Edith Wilson. So she stayed with the president in Paris throughout the negotiations of fall of 1918 into the spring of 1919.
Tell us what a drawing room means. What happened inside of this room?
A drawing room is where you would entertain your guests. The Wilsons did not have that many guests, and when they didn't do it usually in the formal rooms because he didn't like to get all that dressed up. So he entertained most of his guests in the library and in the solarium. Edith went on and did entertain a number of guests.
So there's a lot of interesting artifacts here. What are some of the ones that you like the most in here?
Oh, my favorite is the Gobelin tapestry here behind us.
It's really remarkable.
Isn't that spectacular? So this was a gift to Edith and Woodrow on their wedding. When Edith and Woodrow returned and they had this, it was in the White House. And you could see it's Hermes and Psyche there. It's their wedding. And so that's what it's representing is their wedding. And Edith said, my gosh, I have this house on S Street, but where am I going to put it? It's so big. Yeah. And she thought she would leave it at the White House. And when the people of France heard that she was leaving it, they said, no, that's not to America, that's to you. And you need to take that with you. And they say that they would weave in a parlor game, weave in a little mistake. You would sit in here and the game would be to find what the mistake is on that tapestry. And so, and
do you know what that is?
I do know what it is.
Okay, let's figure it out.
Well, it could take a whole evening.
Why don't you just point it out then?
I'll point it out. You see that little cherub there? If you look very closely at his feet, he has 2 right feet.
Oh yeah.
You see the big toe?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's absolutely right. So this is all hand.
This is all hand woven, yes, of course.
That's amazing.
So this pen, if you can see, we'll go in there. It's the pen is the walrus tusks, but it is the pen that Woodrow Wilson signed the Declaration of War with. Apparently he was ready to sign it and his pen broke and he said, does anyone have a pen? And Edith turned around and gave him her pen.
This fancy pen, she just pulled that out?
Yeah. So
it's
he
really
signed,
beautiful.
It is spectacular, right? Beautiful. She did all these tapestries herself.
Aside from helping run the White House, Edith is known for her needle pointing skills.
You'll see she needle pointed all the dining room chairs.
So did she needle point
yes,
this?
Yes, she did. She did.
So when the French gave her and Woodrow this for their wedding, they really put a lot of thought into what they wanted to give her because they knew that she loved tapestry.
I would imagine that. I think mostly it's because of the Hermes and Psyche as the wedding ring.
Sure.
You hear the clock ring? It was a replica of what they had in the White House, and so they had one here. So we're going up to the third floor.
Okay.
This would have been the private residence. You can tell just by the height of the ceilings and by the finish of the floor and a number of things that you can tell that these are really not the formal rooms. These are really.
It is so open.
It's open.
And spacious.
It's open.
Would this have been difficult for him that since he was sick, you know, coming up and down?
No, the whole reason they chose this house, she chose this house. The first day he ever saw the house was the day they moved in. And she chose this house because it had a trunk lift. And they built it for the trunk room. So they would come for the Washington season. And when Edith saw that possibility, she converted it to be an elevator.
Of course.
And so that's how he came up and down. Yep.
So let's talk about this trunk room. This is kind of amazing.
I've
never heard of such a thing.
I know. This room, we store all the trunks that the Wilsons used actually to all their transatlantic crossings back and forth. If you see some of the tags, it would say, it says what your name and address is. It just says, and where you're going.
Yeah.
This says President of the United States, Europe.
Yeah, figure it out, people.
Figure it out. What I like best here is that, if you can see, that's a map case. And it's, to me, one of the most amazing historical artifacts that we have. The thought that you would be going to negotiate the future of the world and carry the maps in that and carry it on the boat with you. So
it's so interesting in our time period where we just think of, the maps obviously on your phone or on your computer, and you had to bring the maps with you.
And that's what they're negotiating. The future of the world is carried in that map case.
Amazing. This is a beautiful bedroom.
It's a beautiful bedroom. It has the southern exposure. From here, you really would have seen the river because we're so high. But this is Edith's bedroom. Woodrow had a room, the bedroom. There's a nurse's station in between, and then his bedroom's on the other side. Some things we have on display here. She also liked to sew, and so one of the things, hearkening back to the White House, is she was a big supporter of the Red Cross.
She signed up for all of the conservation groups. She had sheep grazing on the White House lawn. The sheep saved manpower. They mowed the grass and freed up the landscapers to go do war work. And then the sheep, as sheep do, got very fluffy, and she arranged with the Red Cross to have their wool auctioned off to benefit the Red Cross. It made so much money. It is still the most expensive wool ever sold by weight.
There's a couple things that I find fascinating about the house in general. I'm amazed at the amount of storage for an older house. What is that?
There's storage in Washington, D.C.
100%.
Everybody who comes to visit the house for a tour will say, my gosh, what great closets. They are great closets.
So it's original. I mean, this,
yes.
Yeah, she didn't put
so these are cedar closets.
I can completely see why she saw this house and bought it on the same day that she saw it when I see the closet space. So there are some items in these closets that are really beautiful.
She liked fashion. There are some things when she would go to Worth's of Paris, and she did like fashion. So black was her favorite color. We have put them out on display occasionally, but we like to keep them preserved and safe so the next generation can see them, share them.
So this is the Juliet balcony.
That's what we call it.
It's really beautiful here.
It's spectacular, isn't it? You're overlooking the backyard we call it the sunken garden.
Yeah.
And in fact, even this is historic. We have not touched this in 100 years in terms of the framework of that stone sunken garden. Last year, we started the renovation of this historic garden to, we asked for donations.
When I came into this house, I had no idea what to expect, but I certainly didn't expect all of this. I mean, it just really opens up in such a spectacular way.
Yes. It's from the front, it looks modest for this neighborhood, but it is 10,000 square feet. Edith chose this house for Woodrow, for them to retire to from the White House, because she said it fitted the needs of a gentleman, and she saw him as a gentleman as he retired from the White House.
President Wilson died in February of 1924, 3 years after he left the White House. She attended every event that honored Woodrow. And that really was her life's work after that. And actually, she died on the day that the Woodrow Wilson Bridge was to be dedicated. She had gotten a cold, she had some respiratory problems, and she died and was not able to attend that event. So until the end of her life, when she was 89, she was still promoting his legacy.
She did well.
She did well.
And she was, for all the things she was an amazing caretaker of her husband. She clearly loved him. And even after he died, the way she preserved his legacy.
Absolutely.
And the way she cared for it is really admirable.
I say she's the first curator of this house, and she did a remarkable job, because we can still tell those stories 60 years later. Here we are telling the stories about Edith and Woodrow with real artifacts, which is nice.
It's the real deal here. Elizabeth, thanks so much for having us. This has been a spectacular tour.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.